10 years ago, there was about 750,000 acres of commercial citrus in Florida. Now there's just 430,000 acres. More importantly, not long ago, there were 30 citrus processors, and now there's about 10. So the industry infrastructure is disappearing for the harvesting and processing of the crop, while the cost of the crop is growing and increasing.
Well, I've served on our Threat Pathogens Committee for the American Phytopathological Society and also for the Department of Defense in various capacities. I'm an emeritus professor, plant pathology at Purdue University, West Lafayette, Indiana. And we keep track of those diseases and situations that would threaten the economic efficiency or the productivity of American agriculture.
My name is Frank Dean. I have a bachelor's degree in biological and physical science from the University of Houston downtown. I've been awarded over 20 patents in chemical synthesis, and I work for Performance Nutrition as a product development manager. As a chemist and biologist who travels the country, I'm seeing a failure of crops to acquire mineral nutrition, utilize the applied nutrients, increased use of pesticides, and yield and quality issues.
Seeing what's going on in the world, it was interesting in the mid-1970s to see some changes that we weren't anticipating. One of the things that I was seeing, both in my capacity as a professor at Purdue University and in these auxiliary capacities, was an increase in disease severity. For diseases that used to be managed quite effectively, we're seeing some of those management options that weren't as effective as they used to be. We were seeing changes in soil conditions. Now, at the same time, we were also changing many of our agricultural practices because we were looking at no-till, we were looking at some monoculture type of programs where we would have, rather than a typical rotation, we would have a crop growing for a number of years. So that there are a number of changes that were taking place. We're seeing a reduced nutrient efficiency. I was working especially on one disease that was a serious problem for us in Indiana as well as other areas where cereal crops are grown, and that was the take-all root and crown rot of cereals caused by a soil-borne fungus. And this disease was increasing in severity where we didn't anticipate it. And so in that, following that disease, I had just completed a 15 or 20 year systematic study of all of the known causes of that disease and all of the known interactions that would influence disease severity. So that what I was seeing was things that didn't fit the typical picture. We had looked at all of those factors and tried to find the common factor that was involved, and that was nutrient deficiency. And that was specifically for manganese for that particular disease, and yet the changes that we were seeing in our agricultural practices couldn't be related directly to that particular nutrient. It was more of a general effect from the agricultural practices, and yet we were seeing this specific disease and several others that were increasing in severity.
Crops are afflicted with diseases they had disease resistance to just a few years ago, and the diseases are much more difficult to control. They won't size or ripen, yields are lower and poorer quality, something doesn't look right, and pesticides and fertilizers don't seem to help. That brings us to the idea of metabolism. Metabolism is a set of life-sustaining chemical reactions within cells of all living organisms. All chemical pesticides act to block metabolism. That brings us to disease resistance. Some pesticides block disease resistance in plants. When disease resistance is blocked by a pesticide, then the plant becomes susceptible to infection. The failure to overcome those disease challenges produce changes in the size, the shape, and the color and luster of plants. I think it happens because of fewer amino acids, fewer fatty acids, and a lower availability of mineral nutrients.
And trying to understand what had changed in that phenomena, we realized that one of the major changes that was influencing nutrient availability was a new herbicide, labeled as a miraculous herbicide as far as its scope.
I believe disease symptoms are caused primarily by the increasing frequency and rate of pesticide applications, the accumulation of pesticide residues in the soil. Glyphosate suppresses plant health and plant defense systems, and it changes the soil microbial ecosystem. When glyphosate blocks the plant antibiotics, the plant becomes unable to protect itself. Glyphosate has a patent to be used as a biocide. A biocide is not an insecticide or a herbicide. It is a biocide. It will kill everything. It acts as an antibiotic, a herbicide, a chelator, and the biocide selects out beneficial soil microbia and reduces mineral availability.
Trying to understand why we always saw the increase in certain of these diseases after the application of this new herbicide, we realized what was really, how unique this chemistry is. Well, all of our herbicides are chelators. The difference between the glyphosate, this new herbicide that was marketed initially as Roundup, the difference between it and other herbicides is that it's a very broad spectrum chelator. Most herbicides are chelators, but they chelate one or two specific minerals to immobilize those and then shut down a specific metabolic pathway. Its initial patent in 1964 by Stauffer Chemical Company was to clean steam pipes and boilers because it would change the scale so that it could be removed from those facilities. And here in 1974, 10 years later, Monsanto patents it as a broad spectrum herbicide, essentially killing most types of plants. And when we recognized that, then we could set up the studies and identify what that mechanism was. Because it's unique in that it doesn't directly kill the plant. It merely shuts down these physiological pathways that are responsible for resistance to disease. And then shutting those down, you essentially give the plant, whether it's a weed or another plant vegetation that you want to control, gives that plant a severe case of AIDS, if you wanted an analogy with a human disease. And that antibiotic activity isn't limited to the soil, and as a very systemic, persistent chemical in the environment and in the plant, its persistence and systemic activity mean that every part of that plant is going to contain the glyphosate herbicide. It moves throughout the plant. 80% will stay in the plant, and about 20% moves out into the soil through the root exudates to affect the soil organisms to promote that disease susceptibility, both from shutting down the defense mechanism and stimulating the pathogen. Working in many areas in the world, we see the same situation where they're witnessing a dramatic increase in severity of these soil-borne diseases, and also many of our foliar diseases are also increasing. That requires increased fungicide use for protection of the plant. In Florida, when one of the diseases that very serious and has been for a number of years in Florida is citrus blight, a disease that's very closely similar to citrus variegated chlorosis. We don't recognize the presence of citrus variegated chlorosis, the CVC, in Florida because that's on our select agents list as a bioterrorist threat to our citrus production here. But citrus blight actually causes more damage than the greening disease, which was introduced long after citrus blight. But in Florida then, for citrus blight, we were able to, again, transfer that nutrient management program and have fairly effective practical management of the citrus blight disease also in Florida. In 2005, there's a new disease that was recognized in Florida, and that was the HLB, Huang Long Bing, or citrus greening disease, as it's more commonly known. That also is caused by a vascular bacterium, but the greening is in a phloem vascular system rather than in the xylem vascular system. So it requires a much different approach with the xylem, where the xylem is where all of your water is translocated and your nutrients are translocated upwards in the plant. With the phloem located bacterium, that's where your sugars and your nutrients, your synthesized nutrients, are translocated to other parts of the plant. And for that one, in developing a management control for greening, we needed to look at foliar applications for effective control.
They say it's vectored by a psyllid. However, the psyllid is attracted to yellow leaves, and glyphosate makes the leaves yellow. They say the infection takes 5 years to show disease symptoms, and the symptoms cannot be induced with bacterial injections. That fails Koch's postulates. If the infection cannot be reproduced in a healthy tree, the circle is not complete. Citrus greening, in my opinion, is actually compartmentalization and concentration of substances made or acquired by the tree, which show up as yellow tissue, which is the psyllid attractant, deformed leaves, which is the failure to produce proteins, short internodes, which is the failure to produce hormones, abnormal flowers and abnormal flowering events, which is also a hormonal event, and disease resistance challenges. I have bought citrus trees myself, a dilute solution of glyphosate. I found I overnight could induce asymmetric chlorosis, and 45 days later I got what's called a death bloom, which was 5 months too early.
We got into looking at these diseases and looking at the approach there primarily because we were seeing all of these diseases increased when this glyphosate herbicide was used. It takes a few years for it to become apparent to a grower. We've had 35, 36 years now of very intense glyphosate usage in most of our cropping systems worldwide. It's the most extensively used chemical that's ever been used in agriculture. And so we see these diseases increasing worldwide. It's of concern agriculturally because of the lost production. It's become more recently recognized as also a very serious animal and human health hazard for us. Agriculture is the basic infrastructure of any society, so anything that affects agriculture is going to affect everything else indirectly or directly. Again, it's a mineral chelator, but also an antibiotic in the body so that it's reducing our nutrient efficiency for our immunity and defense. The chronic toxicity is a very serious concern. We see the 3 lawsuits that have already been finalized in California for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We see 18,000 additional lawsuits filed just on that type of cancer as a result of the chronic toxicity of glyphosate. There are also 32 or 33 other human diseases that are reaching epidemic proportions that are associated with heavy glyphosate or indiscriminate glyphosate usage. And we see these starting to show up in many of our agricultural workers, those that have high exposure. And then a few years after that recognition, we've seen the chronic toxicity of it expressed in our pets and animals and people that are exposed either through water or food or through the air, because this chemical becomes aerosolized, especially in a forest situation or with aerial application or just during heavy agricultural use. So 9 or 10 years ago, I was asked to do some consulting for sugarcane growers in Guatemala. End-stage kidney failure is a very serious concern for us. In Central America, Sri Lanka, and many other areas of the world where glyphosate's extensively used, but in sugarcane, it's used quite extensively as a ripener just before harvest. In Central America especially, we have a very high incidence of end-stage kidney failure of sugarcane workers. Very much a serious problem, so that in El Salvador we're anticipating up to 1 out of 4 sugarcane workers dying from end-stage kidney failure this year. The association's pretty well firmly established with end-stage kidney failure and glyphosate, chelating with the minerals and then plugging up the kidney. And of course, in most kind of areas of the world, you don't have the kidney transplant or the dialysis support systems medically to support those people. Also, in the food, you can't wash it off or remove it from the food. It's also used as a desiccant for many of our cereal crops, especially oats, wheat, barley. The amount of this chemical, again, in our food products has just continued to accelerate or to be increased. And the health problems now are correlated directly with that increased dietary exposure. As Moms Across America study showed that with a high dietary intake of glyphosate in our food, you even have glyphosate in breast milk now. Because of that direct tie of the gut microbiome to our neurochemicals, serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine, all of those chemicals that we rely on for mental function are all produced in the gut GI tract. Diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, many of those autoimmune diseases, all again are escalating to epidemic proportions. Difficile diarrhea, especially for older people, if you're over 65, that disease from Clostridium difficile in your GI tract kills about 80% of the people that develop that condition. So hospitals and retirement homes and facilities all are on the alert and are experiencing that epidemic of Clostridium difficile as a result of the antibiotic activity of the dietary intake of glyphosate. It's not just a problem for agricultural workers in that capacity, but it's essentially the whole population, because it's a very persistent chemical, but it bioaccumulates in the body, and especially in the brain and the bones and bone marrow, and then in all of our organs, the pancreas, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, on all of our muscle tissue. In the C14 studies that Monsanto conducted, it's hard to find any tissue or any part of the body that it doesn't bioaccumulate in. Very important that these concerns be addressed, that the level in our food be reduced.
How does fertilizer contribute to glyphosate availability? Glyphosate is attracted to soil, and it is released back into the soil solution by phosphate fertilizer applications. Animal feed, alfalfa and grains, are sprayed with glyphosate. That feed is then fed to farm animals. The animals cannot digest the glyphosate, so the manure has glyphosate in it. The use of that manure as fertilizer by growers would also release glyphosate into the food system.
Even though you may do an ICP analysis, testing for nutrient density from a mineral standpoint in a food product, if it has glyphosate there also, which most of them do, you'll find that mineral will be chelated with the glyphosate, and it's of no value at all. It's just a piece of gravel as far as the body is concerned. It's a broad spectrum exposure that we have, and having an extremely wide impact then on our health and well-being. 50% of the glyphosate is actually used in forestry and parks and recreation and utility right-of-way vegetation control. So you have a tremendous use and non-agricultural uses and in, exposure from those sources. So the U.S. Geological Survey showed that in Florida alone, there are soils there that have over 2 tons of accumulated glyphosate per square mile. The EPA has registered glyphosate herbicides actually for water, and they've said that a safe level in water is 700 parts per billion. Well, that's 7 times higher than Dr. Monica Kruger showed would cause chronic botulism in cattle with a very short exposure time. Yakima Valley, here in 2008, they had some invasive weeds, and so they said, well, we have to get rid of those weeds out of the water, and they started dumping in rodeo, which is registered by the EPA for use there. Within 2 years, they had the massive epidemic of anencephaly in their children, where the brain doesn't fully develop. If most of the babies are born stillborn, if you get to hold your baby, it's for 24 or 48 hours. I've been told by residents in several lakes in Florida that there isn't a single household that hasn't had at least one family member with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma type of cancer, lymphatic cancer, that lives around that lake where they use it as weed control on it.
Surface waters were collected through South and Central Florida and sent to the Health Research Institute laboratories for analysis of glyphosate and AMPA, a glyphosate degradation product. Virtually all the surface water collected in South Central Florida has a concentration of glyphosate. Coral reefs are also impacted by the use of herbicides on aquatic plants. The 3rd largest coral reef in the world is dying in Florida. Why? Too much nitrogen fertilizer in the water is causing the bleaching of reefs. Farm fertilizer runoff has been blamed for changes in water fertilizer concentration. However, aquatic herbicide sprays can release thousands of tons of fertilizer in a short period of time. Blue-green algae thrive on the released nutrients and can make their own nitrogen from the air. The excess nitrogen combined with the glyphosate in the water increases the reef decline by bleaching of the reefs. Because glyphosate is in the air, rain, water, and soil, the only question is, how much available glyphosate would it take to induce sickness in crops, animals, and people? Herbicides applied to aquatic plants cause algae blooms. Nutrients in aquatic plants are fixed. When those plants die, the nutrients are released into the surface waters. When herbicides are used on aquatic plants, thousands of tons can be released and recycled into the surface of water. Unless and until the aquatic plants are removed from the water, the algae blooms will continue to happen. In 1972, the University of Florida harvested aquatic plants for crop fertilizer. In many Florida soil types, the aquatic plants produce more food per acre than conventional fertilizers. Algae blooms of cyanobacteria thrive in large nutrient load content of aquatic plants killed by herbicides. Besides consuming phosphorus, blue-green algae thrives on glyphosate. Although high concentrations may inhibit it, blue-green algae has been shown glyphosate resistance as a result of pre-selected mutations, and glyphosate serves as a nutrient to these and other microbes that are able to tolerate its effect while killing those less tolerant. Any method of control which does not remove nutrients from the water does not solve the problem. When the weeds are killed, they fall to the bottom and decay. During the decaying process, they use up a portion of the oxygen in the water and deny that oxygen to many forms of animal life in the water. Thus, fish kills. Harvesting also prevents the inevitable algae blooms which follow destroying weeds by herbicides or cutting weeds and leaving them in the water to rot.
It's a great herbicide for many weeds, except the blue-green algae are resistant to it. So that we see the algal blooms then, because they are able to utilize the phosphorus from the glyphosate as a nutrient source. You also have the amino acid part of glyphosate, that glycine amino acid that is merely conjugated with the phosphorus that provides a nitrogen source for the algae. And so we have this intense eutrophication problem with the algal blooms, with the red algae. You also see the toxin production then, so that in Florida you have those lakes or those beaches that you can't even swim on because the toxin levels from the red algae are so intense. Now we see the same thing in general agriculture, where many of the pathogens that produce toxins in our food, the Aspergillus species that produce the aflatoxins, one of the most potent carcinogens known to man, are stimulated by glyphosate. You've compromised the plant's resistance mechanisms and predisposed them for Aspergillus infection. The same thing with the fusarium toxins, so that we're not able to even produce enough wheat for domestic use now that's below the toxic levels for deoxynivalenol, zearalenone, and the T2 toxins, and the toxin levels now that are rendering a lot of our crops that are not fit for human or animal consumption. Glyphosate, again, is designed to kill. An herbicide, but it's also a strong mineral chelator, so that it accumulates in the environment, damages the soil. We see sick soils. Didn't happen overnight because it's a chronic toxin and accumulates in the environment, but it also reduces the nutrient density in the crop from a food standpoint, but also from a seed standpoint, so that our crops are less vigorous when they're growing. One of the common comments that I get when I visit with farmers is, they say, my crop doesn't look as vigorous as it used to look.
Insects, bacteria, and fungi and plant disease are nature's garbage collectors. They are an indication that something is wrong with the system, and the plants are either nutrient deficient or they have a resistance disorder.
By eliminating glyphosate, we can then approach it nutritionally. And one of the things that glyphosate has done for us is it's made farmers recognize that there's a lot of hidden hunger in their crops. That micronutrient deficiencies, for instance, don't show up clearly as clear symptoms, like nitrogen or potassium or phosphorus might show up there, so that you have hidden hunger. And by the time you see a deficiency of manganese or copper or zinc, you've probably lost up to 20% of that genetic potential of the crop. We've compromised quality, we've compromised yield. Glyphosate has been promoted as probably the most safe agricultural chemical that's ever been used. In contrast, I would state that glyphosate is probably the most toxic chronic chemical that has ever been indiscriminately applied throughout the entire environment. It's been promoted as being so safe, and the lie has been told so frequently that people have believed it. And many of us in science accepted it because we were told that it only shut down one enzyme, that was the EPSPS. Well, when you start looking at it, you find there are 291 enzymes that this broad-spectrum chelator tie up and immobilize. The same techniques are used to challenge anyone that opposes glyphosate as were used for tobacco. You have doctors with tobacco that were even saying how it relaxes the individual after a hard day's work to be able to puff on a cigarette and all of that type of thing. You have people that are saying, well, yeah, it's no problem. Well, it may take 15 or 20 years for this chronic toxin to manifest in a critical form, and the lawsuits are really getting the attention that's bringing that about. The non-Hodgkin's lymphoma lawsuits, though, are just the start in this whole process, because the science is even better, even stronger, with the end-stage kidney failure, with Parkinson's, with Alzheimer's, and a number of these other inflammatory bowel diseases because of its antibiotic activity and dysbiosis in the gut. All of those diseases are just waiting in the wings for the attorneys to move in with. To get beyond that, there has to be that recognition, which is coming through the lawsuits, but it also there has to be a supply of non-contaminated products so that you have a choice. Labeling would be a tremendous blessing to the society. If we had labeling so that you could vote with your dollar, exercise that choice for your food, it would make a change very dramatically. They're mid to late 90s of being asked to participate in an international team of scientists in Brazil. The team was put together by Shiyoshi Yamada, head of POTAFOS in Brazil, and this gave me firsthand knowledge then of the devastating effects of a disease that we call citrus variegated chlorosis. This disease has the potential in 6 or 7 years to essentially destroy a citrus tree. It's a common organism that causes it, but a specific virulent strain on citrus that causes the citrus variegated chlorosis. And when that was introduced into Brazil, it appeared that their citrus industry would probably be devastated if a control couldn't be found, and that was the purpose of assembling this international group of scientists working on this type of disease. And I was invited and did participate in that group. In 8 years, we were able to develop a very successful nutrient approach to control the disease. We don't have any chemicals or antibiotics that will control the xylellobacterium that invades the xylem, the vascular system of the plant. And so we're dependent on managing the environment in order to control it. And to do that, then we developed a nutrient regime. There were people who objected. They thought that we were merely pushing organic type programs, but the essence of it was that it was all based on very sound science. We needed to inhibit nitrification so that we could manage the form of nitrogen that the plant was receiving, block that biological process in the soil, and at the same time increase the manganese and zinc essential nutrients that would provide the tree then with those nutrients for resistance to this particular disease. That program has been very successful, and within 3 years of adopting the nutrient management for citrus variegated chlorosis, the disease essentially was fully managed, and yields actually were 110% of what they were before the introduction of the disease, because our nutrient program was also reducing Phytophthora crown rot and some of the other serious diseases on citrus that we experience in most of our citrus growing areas. So it had a very positive effect when we started focusing on nutrition rather than trying to find a chemical that might be effective against that, which no one has been able to do it. Had an entire mill that converted to a nutrient ripening process where we use the essential nutrients, but in a concentration or a relationship then that moves it more into that sugar movement rather than the vegetative growth stimulation that we would have earlier in the season. We just got the results from this last year's harvest season. 64,000 hectare, almost 150,000 acres that is involved in this one mill, about 200 farms. We have check strips on those, or check areas where they continued the glyphosate, but as a ripener versus the nutrient ripening approach that we developed using just boron, manganese, and molybdenum as essential nutrients, but to emphasize sugar production rather than drying down the plant and killing the plant. This mill produced 31,000 ton more refined sugar without the glyphosate than they did with the glyphosate, and at 8% less input cost.
What do we use to remediate the soil? We like to use NutriSmart. It is primarily a humate, starch, and yeast product, which acts as a ecostation to house and feed native bacteria and fungi. That gives them a chance to consume and digest the glyphosate in the soil. What do we use to remediate the crops? We like to use Prudent RX, which is a combination of substances that the glyphosate has blocked and mineral nutrition that the plants need. Our citrus greening program can be found at pnfertilizers.com.
We have to get rid of the product because it's so extensively contaminating everything in our environment, from the water and the air to our food products. Future historians may well look back and write about our time, not about how many pounds of pesticide we did or didn't apply, but about how willing we are to sacrifice our children and jeopardize future generations with this product that has been promoted as being so safe, that's based on flawed science and false promises, just to benefit the bottom line of a commercial enterprise.